The relationships among classmates are actually quite complex. Everyone appears friendly on the surface, but deep down, everyone has their own thoughts. The drinks and meals you have, and that collaboration opportunity, actually, all of it is my contribution. How dare you hit me with a bottle? We are all classmates. We should understand basic respect and boundaries. If you don't treat me well, then don't expect to get off scot-free, especially you, my ex-boyfriend. You definitely don't want your wife to find out about how you almost got played 7 years ago. That was 3 years ago. I returned from abroad. I took over a business landmark called Golden Gate Club in San Francisco. This place is not an ordinary restaurant. It's a secret meeting spot for business tycoons in San Francisco. I don't have high expectations for its profits. It's mainly to filter out those with over $1 billion in assets or significant social status. Only then can they receive a golden invitation. That day, the sea breeze blew in through the window. It carried a salty scent. I was hosting a very important person in the top-floor suite, Thomas Green, the economic advisor from San Francisco. He was wearing a gray sweater. His eyes were very expressive. They looked sharp. He brought his favorite Longjing tea. He declined the expensive drinks I had prepared. We stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. From a distance, you could see the cranes at the dock. In less than 10 minutes of conversation, we finalized a port expansion contract worth billions. Just then, his phone rang. It was a call from the state. He answered quietly. I tactfully left the suite, leaving him alone. Just as I reached the end of the corridor, my assistant Lucas rushed over. He was dressed in a neat suit. His eyes exuded a sense of composure. Sarah, a tech rising star, has arrived at the Ocean View Room on the 3rd floor. He holds a patent for new energy. You want to meet him? Lucas speaks casually, but there's a hint of probing in his eyes. I glanced back at Thomas's booth. I could vaguely see his silhouette through the glass door. Let's go. Let's take a look. Thomas's calls are always long. I don't need to waste time waiting here. Having experienced many years of ups and downs in business, I never miss any opportunity to expand my network. Since Lucas personally invited me, he must have something special about him. I took the elevator down to the 3rd floor, holding a box of truffle chocolates air-freighted from France. I knocked on the door of the Ocean View Room. Come in. A cold voice came from inside, like the winter sea breeze. I pushed the door open and entered, wearing a perfectly timed smile. It was polite yet not too intimate, but just as I reached the door, I froze. The people in the room feel both familiar and unfamiliar to me. It's like an old photograph suddenly coming to life. At the round table directly facing the door sits Emily. She is wearing a dark red kippah. Her demeanor is as cold and elegant as an ice sculpture. 10 years ago, she was driving a Mercedes at the school gate. She almost hit me. Then she rolled down the window and threw out a remark that made me angry. You useless piece of trash. Get out of here quickly. That kind of mocking gaze. I still remember it to this day. Next to her is David. He was once the brightest presence in my youth. Yet he personally rejected my confession. He told me my feelings were worth less than the weeds by the roadside. At this moment, he is holding a little girl with pigtails. His face is full of tenderness, completely different from the indifferent look I remember. 7 years ago, I once saw him on the streets of London by chance. It was drizzling that night. He was standing at the entrance of a bar. He was being pressured by a few middle-aged men to drink. He looked very uncomfortable. Because this is abroad, everyone is like this. Men can't escape it. Moreover, he is a delicately skinned Oriental. I walked over. I pretended to be a friend he knew to help him out. He gave me a grateful glance. He said he wanted to find a quiet place, so we went to a small tavern by the Thames. He was a bit drunk. He leaned on my shoulder. He mumbled. He could get drunk by himself, but he would never let others force him to drink. This is his pride. He clearly said back then he would rather be toyed with by those in power than care about my sincerity. 7 years later, how did he suddenly gain confidence? I asked him half-jokingly. How much is confidence worth? Can I afford it? His eyes were filled with tears. Teardrops fell into the wine glass, but he still stubbornly lifted his head, refused to sell. He said he wanted to give it to me. I said, if you dare to give it, I'll dare to accept it. That night, I took him back to the hotel, but when I woke up the next morning, he had already disappeared into the fog of London. I hesitated whether to chase after him. I even thought about looking down to find him, but in the end, I still went back to my country, thinking that he must still be having fun in London. Unexpectedly, he actually returned to San Francisco as well. Dad, Daisy wants to eat caviar. The little girl tugged at David's sleeve. Her voice was soft. like cotton candy. David lowered his head, gently comforted her. The smile at the corners of her mouth is warm and comforting. He got married. To Emily. At this moment, Emily suddenly turned to the side. She scooped a small spoonful of caviar and handed it to the little girl. Here, Daisy, Mom will feed you. As she spoke, her eyes glanced at me first. Then she fixed her gaze directly on David. Oh, old classmate. It's been 10 years, right? After feeding the little girl. Emily turned around. Her fingers lightly tapped on the table. Her tone was teasing. I remember you got into MIT. How come after all these years, you're still delivering gifts for the club? She paused for a moment. Her smile became even brighter. In her 30s now. Why are you still doing this kind of work? Don't you feel embarrassed? At least you should be a manager or something, right? As soon as she finished speaking, a burst of exaggerated laughter erupted in the room. It surged in like a tide. The people at the table were just like before, instinctively supporting Emily. They surrounded her, like a group of sharks smelling a delicious meal, all wanting to gain a little advantage. During student days, these people echoed her for a piece of chocolate. Now, it might have turned into a ticket to the upper class. To gain a little benefit, who cares about face anymore? I smiled softly, placing the truffle chocolate on the table. The gold foil on the box shimmered with a subtle glow under the light. Here's a small gift for you all. I hope you have fun. Having said that, I was about to leave. I did consider revealing some things to embarrass her, but I still suppressed the impulse. In such a situation, arguing too much would only make me look bad. Let's talk about it. David already has a child. What's the point of me getting involved again? Sarah, Emily hasn't let you go yet. Michael suddenly stood up at the door. He blocked my way. His tone was very provocative. He is Emily's most capable assistant. It was like this 10 years ago, and it still is now. Michael deliberately chose a seat by the door, clearly to step in for her at any moment. Emily also stood up, her elbows resting on the table. Take your time, Sarah. It's rare to have a class reunion. Don't be in a hurry to leave. I still have some matters to handle. I smiled faintly. My tone was very mild. I need to put in more effort. Strive to be promoted to manager before I turn 35. After saying this, the room erupted in laughter again, like firecrackers going off. I stood at the door of the ocean view room. I really couldn't understand what they were laughing about. Is the manager position at the Golden Gate Club really that insignificant? The monthly salary starts at $30,000, plus year-end bonuses and various additional benefits. This made me casually observe their attire. It does look quite nice, but most of it is from brands commonly found during discount seasons. The car keys on the table also reveal their true situation. Basically, they all drive mid-range cars worth around $200,000. Occasionally, there are one or two joint venture subs. However, there's a sense of superiority in their eyes. What is the reason for this superiority? A woman named Jessica seemed to notice me looking at her car keys. She let out a cold huff, in a mocking tone. She said, Sarah, you don't even have a car, do you? This Volkswagen of mine is only worth $150,000. At least it can be used for transportation. You're not still taking the subway, are you? After saying that, she fixed her hair. The mockery on her face was evident. Oh, I usually walk, to be honest. The Seaview duplex I live in is only a 10-minute walk from the club. It's fine to just take a walk usually. As soon as I finished speaking, a burst of harsh laughter erupted around me, like waves crashing against the rocks. It seems they find it boring if they don't laugh at me. After all, we are all Emily's assistants. No one dares to tease each other. Jessica turned to look at David. Her tone became even sharper. David, you were really smart to break up with her back then. Otherwise, you might be taking the subway to deliver takeout now. They laughed even harder, especially Michael, who was standing next to me. He was laughing very joyfully. He was even losing control a bit. David, however, kept his head down. His face looked very pale. He couldn't dare to meet my gaze. What is he afraid of? Is he worried that I might expose the secret from that night in London 7 years ago? I'm not that boring. Emily tapped the table. The laughter suddenly stopped. She pointed at me and said, Sarah, you should stay. I turned to Lucas and mentioned it. Getting you a manager position isn't that hard. She noticed I wasn't speaking and started laughing again. You might not know Lucas. He is an important assistant to the owner of the Golden Gate Club. You're just a runner. You probably never get a chance to meet him. Jessica continued. She was laughing particularly hard. Even if you did see him, Lucas's status is not simple. Even Emily's dad has to be polite when he sees him. How could he possibly pay attention to you? But Sarah is quite attractive. Perhaps Lucas would notice her. He might treat her like a little mistress. After she finished speaking, she was so amused that she started banging the table. I really wanted to ask in my heart, did they think I stole their opportunity? That's why they treated me this way, but I didn't want to argue with them. Nor did I want to reveal my identity. If they find out, they will definitely come to curry favor with me. That would be a problem. Forget it, you all take your time. I have to go. Otherwise, this errand really can't continue. I said this with a smile, preparing to leave, but just then, Michael suddenly kicked the door frame. Blocking my way, he said, "Sarah, are you not going to cherish the opportunity given to you? Emily wants you to stay. You have to obey." He looked at me with sharp eyes. The tone was intense. I cast him a glance, nodded calmly. "All right, I'll stay. This is good." Michael smiled, patted my shoulder. I remembered. "It's the left hand." Emily pointed to the corner where the ice-filled liquor cabinet was. "There are no seats left. You can just stand there." Everyone laughed again. Like a flock of seagulls fighting for food. I shook my head. I thought to myself, it's really childish to the point of being helpless. I walked over. Leaning against the wine cabinet, David suddenly stood up. His voice was almost inaudible. He said, "Stop joking around. Sarah, you can go." Emily's expression changed upon hearing this. She turned and stared at him. She asked, "What do you mean it hurt to see her? I don't feel sorry at all." David gritted his teeth, but his voice trembled violently. "I just don't want to see her." I leaned against the cold wine cabinet, listening to David's shouts. A wave of bitterness surged in my heart. He said this with gritted teeth, as if he was desperately trying to hide something. Maybe he's afraid I'll reveal what happened that night in London. It might affect his marriage with Emily. Emily gave a cold smile, sat back down in the chair, staring intently at me. "You don't want to see her? Then don't look. I actually enjoy watching Sarah. It feels like watching a street performer by the dock. I haven't been this happy in a long time." Michael immediately chimed in, smiling in a very flattering way. "Sarah, stop running errands for them. Go work as a receptionist at Emily's company. If she's happy, she might even give you some pocket money." They laughed again. Like a hen that just laid an egg. So incredibly happy. I didn't really mind, speaking calmly. "Forget about the receptionist job. Once I save enough money, I'll take over Emily's company. By then, I'll be the boss." After saying this, they were first taken aback. Then she laughed even louder. David didn't laugh. He just lowered his head, but his eyes were red, as if he had been crying. He looked at me. His expression was complicated, as if he was asking me to leave. Emily was laughing happily. She wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes. "Sarah, you really are wealthy. I will definitely sell the company to you. But by then, the value of my company will have doubled. You might not be able to afford it." I didn't respond. I didn't want to say much to her. Michael, however, was like a clown. He leaned in and asked, "Emily, are you saying the company has received a big order again?" "That's right." Emily proudly shook the wine glass in her hand. "I heard that the owner of the Golden Gate Club is a rising star in the business world, brought back with much effort by the head of San Francisco. I heard that this person's first project is a port project worth billions. In recent years, San Francisco's economy has stagnated somewhat. The planning for the new dock still has half of it unused. She just wants to take this opportunity to come. My dad has some connections with the city officials. We might get some projects out of it. That's quite a bit of profit." After she finished speaking, she glanced at me sideways. Her tone became more relaxed. "Sarah, I still remember how you were scared stiff when you saw my family's Benz 10 years ago. I still have that car. Can you drive? If you could drive, you could come and be my driver. You can drive it however you want. I only know how to ride a bicycle." I said this in a very casual tone. They laughed again. Is it that my jokes are too lowbrow, or perhaps they're like Harris from America? They laugh first when something happens. Maybe it's because I've always appeared very calm. They seemed a bit disappointed, especially Emily. She originally wanted me to embarrass myself. Seeing that I had no reaction, her expression became even gloomier. She pointed at a bottle of whiskey on the table and asked, "Sarah, have you ever tried this liquor? This liquor is quite expensive. Today, I'll let you experience it. Once we finish this bottle, I'll let you go. I don't drink. I'm allergic to seafood, let alone strong liquor. I just don't drink." I shook my head, feeling a bit impatient. "Emily, actually, I'm the owner of the Golden Gate Club, the huge port project you mentioned. I'm also in charge of that. I'm being serious." My tone was as calm as discussing the weather, but they were taken aback for a moment. Then the whole place burst into laughter. Michael pointed at me. laughing so hard they could barely breathe. He said, "Sarah, you really know how to joke. You must have learned to tell jokes at MIT." Jessica was holding her stomach, laughing so hard that tears were streaming down her face. "I'm about to laugh myself crazy. Why don't you say you're the Secretary General of the United Nations?" I sighed, looking at them. "Haven't you ever seen a courier delivering gifts who graduated from MIT? Isn't that a bit abnormal?" They were stunned, but their eyes still held disdain. Emily let out a cold laugh. She stood up. "What use is a courier? The most important thing is you're in front of me. You'll always be a broke loser." She pointed at the bottle of whiskey. Her tone became serious. "Either you drink this bottle of liquor, or I'll smash you with this bottle. You choose." David suddenly stood up, grabbed the bottle of liquor. "I'll drink it for her. After drinking, let her go." His voice trembled a bit, but his hand held on tightly. In the ocean view room, everyone's gaze was focused on me. I'm leaning against the wine cabinet, slowly taking a piece of sea salt caramel out of my pocket. Leisurely tearing open the packaging, the candy wrapper glimmers under the light. I didn't look up. I've been standing for a while. I'm a bit tired. I need to eat some candy. I put the caramel in my mouth. The sweet and salty taste spreads on my tongue. "Big sister, how does it taste?" The little girl in David's arms somehow ran in front of me. She looked up. Her eyes sparkled as she looked at me. I smiled. I took out another piece of food and handed it to her. "Try it yourself, David. Quickly take care of your child." Emily suddenly shouted loudly. Her voice was sharp like the sea wind blowing over metal. David's face suddenly turned pale. He slammed the bottle of wine down on the table. He lowered his head and held the little girl tightly. "Hold her in your arms." I frowned. My heart was filled with confusion. Just now, Emily said she was the mother of this child. How did she suddenly start scolding the little girl? As I was in doubt, I suddenly felt a sharp pain in the back of my head. Michael had somehow sneaked up behind me. He swung an empty bottle at me. "Why don't you listen? Didn't you hear me tell you to stand still?" He shouted. His face was flushed red, like a hound eager to show off. He was too eager to impress Emily. He wanted to draw attention in front of Thomas and Lucas even more. David suddenly grabbed the whiskey from the table. He brought it down heavily on Michael's head. The bottle shattered on the spot. Glass and liquor spilled everywhere. She was panting. Her eyes were filled with anger. She warned, "If you touch her again, I will never let you go." Michael is holding his forehead. Blood is flowing from between his fingers. His face is full of surprise. Lucas was momentarily stunned. He quickly ran over. He supported my shoulder. He carefully checked my head. He saw that I wasn't injured. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. However, he still kept me behind him. He stared at Emily with a cold gaze. "Emily, I only let you into the Golden Gate Club because of your father. You can't even take care of your own dog. How dare you come and bash my boss's head?" As soon as those words were spoken, the entire scene fell silent. It felt like the calm before a storm. The person who was just laughing the hardest now has turned pale, as if they saw something terrifying. Lucas's voice became even colder. Everyone heard it. "I am the young master of the Smith family in New York. Sarah is the woman I would rather give up my family business for. You are going to hurt her today. I'll have your mother send you back to start over." The Smith family from New York. Michael and Jessica exchanged glances. Clearly, they have never heard this name. But Emily was trembling in fear. Her face was pale. The Smith family from New York. The influential Smith family in the business world. 3 former high-ranking officials. Has it already reached the 5th generation? Thomas also walked over. He frowned and looked at me. "Sarah, should we go to the hospital for a checkup? We can put the Port matter on hold for now. I'll handle these people." Listen to his tone. He seems a bit anxious. Emily's voice was trembling. She was almost on her knees. "Uncle Thomas, are you mistaken? This Sarah is just a useless person. She was so scared by my family's Mercedes 10 years ago that she couldn't move." Thomas shot her a cold glance. "Speak. Your dad wants to take on the infrastructure project for the new dock. I mentioned it a long time ago. Sarah's approval is needed. This is Sarah, whom I put a lot of effort into inviting back." At this moment, the ocean view room is as quiet as underwater. You can even hear the sound of breathing. David looked up at me. His eyes were filled with shock and a bit of an indescribable grievance. I rubbed the back of my head and sighed as I said, "Thomas, let's leave it at that for today. We'll talk later. Okay, I'll wait for your news." Thomas nodded. He turned to Lucas and said, "Lucas, take good care of Sarah tonight." "Don't worry," Lucas replied. A hint of a smile appeared on his lips. Emily and the others obviously didn't want to leave, but it felt like their feet were nailed to the ground. Just then, the club's security came in. They dragged them out like they were herding ducks. Even David, holding the little girl, was pulled out. He kept looking back with every step he took. His eyes were a bit moist. Lucas suddenly leaned over. He half-jokingly wrapped his arms around me. "I'm still here. How can you look at other men? Don't you fear that I might get jealous?" I saw David pause for a moment. Finally, tears streamed down. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't get the words out. Half an hour later, I returned to my seaside apartment. I collapsed onto the sofa. The private doctor left only after confirming everything was fine. Lucas leaned against the window. He held a glass of Bordeaux red wine. The lights of the harbor shone outside. It made his profile look both soft and sharp. The wine gently touched his lips. It was like applying a layer of dark red sheen on him. Since that night in London 7 years ago, I haven't been involved with any other man. Lucas mentioned wanting to give it a try, but in the end, he still has to return to New York for an arranged marriage. This is something everyone understands. I occasionally look for some handsome male models to take pictures as a keepsake, but it's just for looking. I have no other thoughts. That person. Do you know him? Lucas suddenly asked. His tone was very casual. I nodded. I briefly mentioned what happened 10 years ago. Back then, Emily almost ran into me. She even scolded me for being useless. I also brought up the incident of running into each other in London 7 years ago, but I didn't mention it. Lucas squinted and observed me for a while. I could tell he has feelings for you. The gaze of someone in love cannot be deceived. Ah, I was taken aback for a moment. Then I smiled wryly. What's the point of saying all this? He already has a child. He now has a daughter, so there's no need to go through the trouble of having another. Lucas rolled his eyes. His tone was somewhat teasing. Don't do that, I sighed. Actually, he really was protecting me today. That time I got beaten up. He even hit Michael. David's thoughts left me a bit puzzled. Lucas placed the wine glass on the windowsill. Then he turned around and looked at me. Either find someone to help inquire, or just go ask yourself. I'm leaving, take your time to think. I'm going on a date, he waved, and pushed the door open to leave. Should I check? Forget it. It's better to ask myself. I made up my mind. I just collapsed on the sofa and fell asleep. The next morning, Lucas came to knock on my door to wake me up. Behind him, Emily and her friends had all arrived. As soon as they entered, they all knelt down together. Emily even slapped herself to take the lead. "Sarah, I'm really sorry. Please don't pursue it any further if you're not feeling good about it. Then punish us." I'm rubbing my eyes, leaning on the sofa. My mind hasn't fully cleared yet. Lucas is squatting beside me, holding a wet towel in his hand, gently wiping my face. To the people outside, they might think our relationship is quite good. I waited for a few minutes, before looking at Emily and them kneeling on the ground. "Get up. I'm not going to pursue what happened last night." I said it very lightly, but I have my own plans in mind. Having been in this circle for so many years, I have never been too explicit about revenge. If I really want to take action, I will do it quietly. Those who act very excited often lack real strength, and I've never really understood. Why do these people like to kneel? Do they not know? Their knees mean nothing to me. They are even less significant than some good food. Emily raised her head. Her eyes were filled with shock. "Do you really not care?" Her voice sounded somewhat tentative. After all, she is a rich girl from San Francisco. She has always believed in an eye for an eye. I nodded. My tone was very calm. "I know you might not want to hear this, but you really are not qualified to compare with me. Let's go." Except for Emily, the others seemed to have no reaction. They stood up. Lowering their heads, they prepared to leave, but Emily did not move. After hesitating for a moment, she asked, "Sarah, what will happen to our family's collaboration?" She bit her lip. A hint of greed appeared in her eyes. I smiled slightly. I took a sip of the coffee beside me. "It's about the cooperation. I will talk to your dad. You don't have the authority to decide. After all, I am a businessman. I won't let personal grudges affect my business. It's not worth it. You can leave with peace of mind." Emily let out a sigh of relief. It felt like a heavy burden had been lifted off her shoulders. She hurriedly took her people and left. The door slammed shut with a loud bang. My expression turned serious. I slowly placed the coffee cup back on the table. Lucas leaned against the door. He looked at me with a hint of a smile. I glanced at him. My tone became cold. Michael patted my shoulder with his left hand last night. Lucas raised an eyebrow. He took out his phone. Got it. He dialed a number. He said softly, "Get a dog paw, the one on the left." I continued speaking. "Emily's family is about to split up as well." Lucas nodded. The corners of his mouth curled slightly. "I will handle this matter personally. As long as I have Thomas's support, there's nothing to worry about. Actually, this isn't difficult. I always prioritize reason in business. If anyone wants to obstruct me, I will make them bear the consequences. After arranging these matters, I stood up and left the apartment. My car was waiting outside, a black one, with a touch of red on the front. It looked understated yet stable. As soon as I opened the car door, I heard whispers coming from the corner. Jessica was huddled in the shadows, muttering quietly. They're really driving a domestic car. Michael had a bandage wrapped around his head. He replied in a slightly hoarse voice, "It's a Cadillac, and it's the type with a flagpole." Jessica curled her lip. Her face showed a look of disdain. "What's wrong with Cadillac? How much is it? I could sell 10 of them." Michael is smiling, but it also feels a bit puzzling. "Haha, you have some money in your pocket. You can buy that kind of cigarette at the convenience store, but you have 2 legs. Can you walk through that door?" It's the same with cars. Emily hears this conversation. A chill runs through her. She drives back to the company. She pushes open her father's office door. Emily's father is sitting behind the desk. His brow is furrowed. Seeing her come in, he immediately stands up. "How is it? Have you handled it?" Emily breathes a sigh of relief. She feels a bit lighter. Sarah said she doesn't care about these things. She stated that she is a businesswoman. She won't let personal grudges affect the interests of both parties. She also said she would discuss cooperation with you. After all, she is a big shot. Her level is not something I can compare to. Emily's father nods first, but his expression becomes increasingly serious. He suddenly stood up. He slapped the table. "You said Sarah doesn't care and still wants to talk to me." "Yes." Emily nodded. Her face was full of confusion. Emily's dad glared at her. His voice rose. "I just checked on this Sarah. She seems gentle on the surface, but those who offend her end up with no good results. There's a rich second-generation kid in New York. He was schemed against by her for 3 years. In the end, he even lost his life. It was related to a smuggling case at sea." Emily was stunned for a moment. She swallowed hard. "Dad, are you overthinking this? You should just stay put. Don't run around." Emily's dad said anxiously, "I will have someone keep an eye on you. Let's talk after I resolve this." At that moment, Emily's phone rang. She answered the call. She heard Jessica crying and saying, "Emily, come help quickly. Michael had an accident. We were hit by a delivery truck. His left hand is injured." What? Emily's voice was as sharp as a knife. "Who did it? Do you know him?" "No, I don't know him. Just a delivery driver." Jessica replied through her sobs. After Emily hung up the phone, she turned to look at her father. Emily's father frowned. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Let me send someone to protect you. You should also go to the hospital for a checkup. Talk to Michael properly. He is easier to persuade. That might be useful." Not long after, Emily arrived at the hospital. Michael had just finished surgery. He only woke up at night. Emily was keeping vigil by the bed. As soon as she saw him open his eyes, she quickly asked. Michael gasped a few times. He opened his eyes wide and shouted, "I tapped Sarah on the shoulder with my left hand last night." Emily was startled. Her hand shook for a moment. "That's impressive." She turned around and ran outside. She called her dad. After a while, she came back. She talked to Michael for a long time. Meanwhile, I finally found a lead on David. He was hiding very well. I used several connections to find him. At the end of the day, I finally found out he lived in a fishing village in the suburbs of San Francisco. When I arrived, there was only a little girl named Daisy at home. She was wearing a faded little dress. Shyly, she opened the door for me. She recognized me. She sweetly called Messister. Then she tiptoed. She reached into the sink and took out a wrinkled apple to hand it to me. I took a bite of the apple. She looked at the apple. She was almost drooling. It was clear. This child probably doesn't get to eat fruit very often. I had the bodyguard go buy some snacks and fruits. Then I began to inspect this small room of less than 15 square meters. Although the room is small, it is kept quite clean. You can still smell a hint of the sea in the air. The fish market is right next door. The smell is really unpleasant. I stood at the door of the small fishing village house. I saw David sitting on the ground, holding Daisy. His tears fell like broken beads, dripping onto the old wooden floor. The sea breeze howled outside, bringing a salty scent into my nose. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "Whose child is Daisy? This has nothing to do with you." David almost yelled. His voice sounded hoarse as if it had been ground down. His reaction made me even more certain of my inner suspicion. "Can you keep this from me?" I retorted. My voice trembled a bit. "He is like a deflated balloon." Leaning against the wall, holding Daisy, tears and snot are flowing down together. He said, choking on his words. It's my sister's. She went out to sea to fish with her husband 3 years ago. They encountered a storm. As a result, they were lost. Why didn't you tell me earlier? My voice suddenly raised, filled with anger and heartache. You spent 7 years in this broken place with the child. David wiped his face. He gave a bitter smile. After what happened in London 7 years ago, I came to look for you. I went to the bottom of your apartment building. I saw you walk in with several male models. I felt a bit uncomfortable inside. I choked up a bit. Tears welled up again. I was stunned. It felt like something was stuck in my throat. Then, I tried to calm down. I suppressed my emotions. You embarrassed me in public 10 years ago, and you chose Emily. Can't I date someone else 10 years ago? David was crying and laughing. She looked up at me. Her eyes were filled with disappointment. Sarah, you might never know. The first time you helped me with my homework, I secretly started to like you then. I was a bit afraid to say it. After that, I was even more afraid to be with you. Emily warned me. She said if I was good with you, she would make sure you couldn't graduate. He smiled painfully. Teardrops fell onto Daisy's hair. Before graduation, we agreed to take the MIT exam together, but she found me. She said as long as I didn't get together with you, she wouldn't force me to date her. If I didn't do that, she would have someone hurt you before the exam. I had no other choice. I can only agree. Hearing these words, I couldn't help but shed tears. Although I had some suspicions in my heart, but hearing it in person still hurt me a lot. Then he continued to speak. She also said, even after the exam is over, I still have to keep my distance from you. She never wants to have any contact with you in her life. Otherwise, she has many ways to make you uncomfortable. Her family is wealthy and influential. I'm still afraid she will really do that. He looked down at Daisy. His voice became softer. Later, my grades were affected. Although I still went to New York, I secretly went to see you, but I didn't dare to show up. Because I was worried I wouldn't be able to resist looking for you. That would affect you. If it weren't for that day, I saw you with the male model. I originally wanted to clarify things with you for Daisy's sake. At this moment, I was at a loss for words. My heart felt like it was being twisted. Then he raised his head. With red eyes, he said, Sarah, I have kept my innocence for you for 7 years. Since that night in London, I held on for another 7 years. But you have Lucas by your side, and he is my brother, so I interrupted him, hurriedly explaining, Lucas wants to return to New York to marry. Those male models were just there for the photos. I never touched them. David, give me a chance. I want to take care of you all. You are not wrong. David smiled wryly, shook his head from your perspective. I am the one who abandoned you. If you could help me keep it. It's really strange. He paused. Then he said, I actually didn't want to go to the party last night. But Daisy is starting elementary school. I was thinking of finding a good job to change the environment. Emily deliberately said she was Daisy's mother. I didn't dare to oppose. She shot me a glare. I'm a bit afraid she won't be nice to you, I understand. I sighed. I walked over to pull them, father and daughter, together. Can you give me a chance? I tried to gently hold him, as if afraid of breaking something. He didn't say anything, nor did he push me away. Daisy's eyes were wide open, looking confused. The bodyguard returned with fruits and snacks. Daisy happily ran over to eat. David and I sat on the wooden bench in the cabin. We chatted for 2 hours. The sound of waves came from outside. It crashed against my heart, wave after wave. He told me how hard it has been to work at the dock over the years. Because he's handsome and willing to endure hardship, he often gets excluded by his colleagues. The boss and clients always hint that he should entertain them with drinks and play. But he just doesn't want to. In the end, he could only go to the seaside with his parents to sell fish. His sister and brother-in-law had helped him when they were alive. But fishermen's income is generally low. How much could there be left over? I held his hand. I said seriously, from now on, you and Daisy don't have to worry about money anymore. What I lack the least now is money. He shook his head. His eyes were as clear as the sea. He said, money doesn't matter to me. I've never wanted much. But Daisy's future will definitely be bright. That night, I took them back to my seaside apartment. The apartment was bright and cheerful. You could see the twinkling stars in the harbor from the window. The next day, I went to find Thomas to apply for special approval. David and I went to get the certificate and registered Daisy's household account. I told Daisy to call me Mom. She called out hesitantly. The sound was as sweet as honey. A few days later, Lucas suddenly called me. He said, Sarah, come to the warehouse at the dock. I went there with David. Daisy stayed at home. She was watched over by the bodyguard. We walked into an abandoned warehouse. The air was filled with the smell of rust. Inside, there were several people we recognized: Emily, Michael, Jessica, and a few classmates. They were tied up with ropes, like fish struggling in a net. A short distance away, a cutting machine was buzzing. It was spitting out flickering sparks. Lucas was sitting on an old chair. He was playing with a dagger in his hand. David was trembling in fear. He was gripping my hand tightly. I frowned and asked Lucas, "Lucas, what's going on?" This isn't like Lucas. He's good at making plans. He wouldn't act so directly. Lucas smiled. He tossed away the dagger. I contacted Emily's dad's driver. Only then did I learn they planned to steal your car at the dock. You know, I like to take my time. They struck first, so I chose a simple and direct approach. I squinted to take a look. Indeed, I saw Emily's dad there too. He was hanging at the edge. His face was filled with fear. As soon as Emily saw me, she shouted loudly, "Sarah, we're classmates. Please spare me this once. I don't want to die. When you were planning to take action against me, did you think about letting me live?" I asked coldly. She shouted excitedly, "Stop pretending. I know the methods you use. The rich second-generation kid from New York was killed by you in the sea. Even if I don't take drastic measures against you, you wouldn't let me go either. That's right." I nodded. My voice was very calm. "You will eventually face this outcome. There's no escaping it. Especially knowing that you threatened David 10 years ago. I want to make you uncomfortable even more." After saying that, I pulled David and turned to leave. "Leave a message for Lucas. Don't leave any traces. Burn everything to the ground." Lucas responded with a few words. Smiling. Days later, my port project finally started construction. The sky in San Francisco became a bit gray due to the roar of the cranes. I haven't directly participated in specific matters, only responsible for the general direction. The details are all handled by Lucas. He is by the dock, holding a pile of documents. The wind blows his hair wildly. I'm with David and Daisy. We moved into a villa by the sea. The new home has a small yard. It's planted with roses that withstand the sea breeze. Every morning, David and I take Daisy for a walk on the beach. She walks barefoot on the sand, picking up shells and laughing happily. Watching them, my heart finally feels warm and stable. Later, we held another wedding in the villa. We didn't invite too many guests, only a few close friends and Thomas. Lucas served as the witness. He joked that this was his last time helping me. David's parents also came. I bought them a set of houses in the city. Everything was arranged. The only thing I need to do in this life is to live happily with David and Daisy and continue living happily.